On the 20th of July 2026, a second choke point went dark. For 5 months, the world had been watching one narrow stretch of water. Now it was watching two. The Houthis, an armed group controlling part of Yemen, announced a full naval blockade of Saudi Arabia through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. 4 million more barrels a day, suddenly in question. Brent crude jumped 10% in a single session, and a war that was supposed to be ending was doing the opposite. The coin Trump is flipping. A week earlier, it looked like this might actually be over. A ceasefire from June was still technically alive. Oil was moving again, slowly. Then Iranian missiles hit a Qatari LNG carrier off the coast of Oman. 2 more tankers were struck days later. Washington tore up the sales waiver it had signed 3 weeks before. Within 72 hours, the strait had gone from cautiously open to nearly empty. On some days last week, 4 tankers made the crossing. Before the war, it was over 120. So now there are 2 paths on the table, and only one man is choosing between them. Option 1, a new 10-day ceasefire, floated by Qatar, Egypt, and Pakistan, aimed at reopening the strait long enough to let the world catch its breath. Option 2, a joint campaign with Israel large enough to force Tehran into full capitulation. Officials say the decision could come within days. And whichever way it goes, it will not be based on what's best for Japan, or Germany, or the price of bread in Cairo. It will be based on what one government in Washington and one government in Tehran think they can survive politically. This isn't the first time this exact choice has come up. Back in April, a similar deal appeared, brokered by Pakistan, a 2-week ceasefire in exchange for safe passage. It held for a while, traffic partly recovered. Then it broke. In June, a second version appeared, this one nearly permanent, with preparatory meetings in Doha and France offering warships to help escort tankers through once both sides signed off. It held a little longer than the last one. Then it broke too, the moment Israeli strikes hit Beirut, and Iran responded by hitting a ship instead of a soldier. Twice now, the world has watched this exact cycle complete itself. A deal, a pause, a single unrelated spark somewhere else in the region, collapse. The second door. Here's what makes this moment different from every other point in the last 5 months. Until last weekend, the world had a workaround. When Hormuz closed, Saudi Arabia could still move a share of its oil overland and out through the Red Sea instead, bypassing Iran's water entirely. It wasn't a full replacement, but it took some of the pressure off. That workaround just closed too. The Houthis have missiles, drones, and small fast boats, the same toolkit Iran has used in Hormuz. They don't need to sink every ship. They only need to make insurers nervous enough to stop covering the ones that try. The Yemen campaign pushed that threat, the math that doesn't care. The mechanism hasn't changed since the crisis started in February. It was never really about whether a ship could physically get through. It's about whether anyone will insure it. A missile doesn't have to hit anything. The rumor of a mine, the report of a strike 40 miles away, that's enough for a London underwriter to pull coverage on a vessel that hasn't even left port yet. No insurance, no captain willing to sail. That single fact is why a fraction of the normal traffic is getting through Hormuz right now, and it's the same fact that's about to apply to Bab el-Mandeb. Layer both choke points on top of each other, and roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil and a third of its natural gas trade are sitting on top of 2 separate decisions being made by 2 separate armed groups, neither of whom answer to a shipping company, an airline, or a government that actually needs the oil. Japan gets 70% of its oil through this region. South Korea sent its own diplomat to Tehran, not to negotiate policy, just to ask, quietly, whether its ships would be allowed through. That is where the leverage sits right now, not in Washington, not in Brussels, in whichever militia decides to let a tanker pass. What ends this and what doesn't? The reopening of the strait is still, in the words of the International Energy Agency, the single most fix for the entire global energy picture. But every previous ceasefire this year has broken within weeks, sometimes days. The June truce held just long enough for shipping to partly recover, then collapsed the moment Israeli strikes hit Beirut and Iran responded. The April truce fell apart just as fast. There is a pattern now. 5 months deep. A deal gets announced. Markets exhale. Traffic ticks up. Then something happens somewhere else in the region. Lebanon, a struck mediator, a downed drone, and the whole arrangement resets to zero. That pattern is the actual story here. Not whether this particular ceasefire holds, but whether any ceasefire can hold when the conflict has this many separate fuses. Iran, Israel, the Houthis, Hezbollah, each one capable of reigniting the whole thing without needing permission from the other three. France has already said it's ready to send naval forces to help restore shipping the moment Washington and Tehran actually agree on something. China has cut helium exports, citing the war, disrupting semiconductor and hospital supply chains thousands of miles from any of this fighting. The strategic reserves that bought the world time back in March are lower now than they were then. There is less runway underneath this than there was when it started. There have also been attempts to fix this at the diplomatic level, above the shipping companies and the insurers. Britain and France have studied an Omani proposal that would let an international body, backed by the United Nations Maritime Organization, collect navigation fees and help stabilize the strait long-term. An actual structural fix instead of another ceasefire built to break. Russia and China, for their own reasons, blocked a UN resolution earlier this year that was aimed at forcing the strait back open. So even the idea of an outside authority solving this runs straight into the same wall as everything else. 5 separate powers, 5 separate sets of incentives, and no single body with the standing to just make the decision for everyone downstream. The door that doesn't stay open. Iran still needs its own oil revenue. The Houthis still answer in part to Tehran, which still has its own reasons not to let this spiral into something it can't control either. That's the same leverage that eventually reopened Hormuz for stretches earlier this year, and it will probably reopen both straits again for a while. But probably, for a while, is not the same as solved. The countries burning through their reserves right now, the ones with no ships in this fight and no seat at the negotiating table, have learned the same lesson twice this year. The door doesn't need to be permanently shut to break the world's supply chains. It just needs to close often enough and unpredictably enough that no insurer will bet on it staying open. 5 months ago, that was true of one stretch of water. Now it's true of 2. The tankers will move again. They always do. The question this time isn't whether the door reopens. It's how many doors the rest of the world can afford to have close at once.